Dateline, Deseret News, May 12th, 1869. Quote, "The Great Central Pacific Contest for the Track Laying Championship, though an accident, did not finally come off till Wednesday. It was witnessed by the magnates of both railroads. The aggregate number of ironmen, splicers, and screwers, spikers, and supernumeraries employed in laying the track was about 848, besides 92 horses. The Central Company are in the habit of laying their rails on but one half the complement of ties, filling in the remainder as they are brought to the front on the trains. There were, on this occasion, 2,000 Chinese men putting in the back ties and surfacing the track. The 848 men and 92 horses laid the 10 miles of track in 16 working hours. Their whole force at the front is about 8,000, the most powerful track-laying force ever organized. Mr. Trowbridge is the superintendent of construction, and Mr. Minkler is in charge of track laying on the Central Pacific. At no time, I am informed, have the casemates had more than 300 men on track laying at once, inclusive of the tie laying." End quote. I'm Wendy. This is Demolish Salt Lake, and part 2 of my conversation about the Transcontinental Railroad with Chris Merritt from Utah State Historic Preservation Office. Hello and welcome to episode 22. This is part 2 of my interview with Chris Merritt. If you haven't listened to part 1, go and do that now. I don't want you to miss out on hearing the full story. And on that note, on with the episode.
But yeah, it's all connected. I mean, all history is connected if you dig enough.
Right. Okay, so then we're going to move on to, so we're going to leave National Park, the visitor center, and we're going to go over to 10 Mile, and we kind of talked about this a little bit. This is, I actually laughed when I read this story because it was just so ridiculous. Like these two men were having this, argument of who could lay more track in one day and then put their laborers through, I'm sure it was hell to win the bet. Right.
And when you reflect on 1869, you had the duels of egos.
And I think that's what made me laugh was that these pompous gentlemen, were like, I can outdo you. No, I can outdo you. It's like a duel, right?
and it was a duel based on other people's labor.
Right. It wasn't even them.
It's like your perfect, classic rich man's bet. Yeah. You have nothing to stay. It feels like a Twilight Zone episode, right? Yeah. It's like you're betting on somebody else's lives.
Right.
And yeah, it was a bet between the Union Pacific and Central Pacific, head engineers, and some of the vice presidents were involved in it. And over the course of 1868 and 69, as the terrain improved, right, after the Central Pacific got out of the Sierras, they started cutting across Nevada, it improved.
A lot better.
There was a lot flatter terrain in the valley bottoms. And then as you're coming across Wyoming's pretty flat on that part of Wyoming. And so the crews were able to speed up. And they were able to speed up in a way that allowed records to be set, almost weekly for a period. And over 1869, there was sort of I can do 4 miles. Oh, I did 5 miles. I did 6 miles. And finally, in Wyoming and eastern Utah, the Union Pacific Railroad did 7 miles in a day, which is staggering.
That is 7 miles of track. So we're talking, you have to have your graders, right? You have to have the people grade it out, and then you have to lay the track, and you have I can't imagine what that was like for them.
Yeah, grading, laying the ties, laying the rail. And there's a great 1920s sort of story, but it really puts in perspective how much material that is even. Not even just the labor, but, rail came in 12-foot segments. You needed 2, right, side by side.
Right.
So how many of those in 7 miles?
Yeah, how did they did they go through their entire supply?
They cook through them. And as we go to the response, so, they did 7 miles, and they kind of thumbed their nose at the Central Pacific, you're never going to break this. And so the Central Pacific, we'll bet you $10,000 that we can do 10 miles in a day.
$10,000?
Yes.
I mean, I guess that also shows how much money they were making off the railroad.
Mm-hmm. And how much they were willing just to splurge.
I mean, just in that time frame, like, these were millionaires that were making so much money off of building the railroad and off of the backs of these workers that they had enough money to bet $10,000.
Mm-hmm. And it makes you feel like
blows my mind.
They're wearing an ascot on a yacht, right? When you picture this conversation, like, oh, I can do 7 miles,
right?
It's
right.
Like, it's such a crazy world to think about. But yeah, the Central Pacific said we'll build 10, and they tried on April 26th to build 10, but one of the supply trains derailed, and so they had to reconfigure.
Okay.
So then on April 28th. Estimated 3,000 to 4,000 Chinese laborers, another 300 to 400 Teamsters and freighters. So Teamsters are the guys that haul wagons.
Okay.
The mule skinners.
So actually, like, team.
Yeah. They're running horse teams.
They're running
or
horse
mule
teams. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And so they had all that, and then all the material.
Okay.
So we talked about 12-foot lengths of rail times 2 times 10 miles. Each mile of track usually takes about 3,300 railroad ties. So that's the wood that the rails is attached to.
Okay.
So 3,300, that's 33,000, railroad ties.
Okay.
Most ties were being cut 2 per tree.
Okay.
So there's 15,000 trees in this 10-mile construction.
Wow.
Each one of those rails is being held together by 4 bolts on each end.
All right.
Right? You just start adding up.
Right.
And then each rail is being connected to ties by 2 spikes. So suddenly 3,300 spikes, you're now talking 6,600. Right? Suddenly the numbers become like
astonishing.
Staggering.
Yeah.
Like how they had to have everything prepped. And it speaks, like we said earlier, to the organization that they just got up at 7 o'clock in the morning and built 10 miles and 50 some odd feet.
Jeez.
And then got done by dinner with a lunch break.
I can't even fathom. Like, I really can't fathom. But I also would think, like, the celebration that the men felt after, like, look what we did, and then probably,
exhaustion.
Drank and had some opium and
just had to have a little bit of exhaustion. But
right.
That's the other thing too, is that the workers had pride in it. Yes, it was a rich man's bet, but there was pride in that crew that they did something.
They did that.
And even today with modern technology, one, we're not trying to build that fast. This has never been broken.
Really?
In all of human history since 1869, there has not been 10 miles of track built in a day.
Wow. And it was accomplished then.
And so as you leave Golden Spike Visitor Center and you go south and you get sort of where the cutoff is to Spiral Jetty, just a few, like maybe even a half mile from that is Roselle, which was called Victory Camp.
Yes.
That was where the 10 miles ended.
Okay.
So if you get to Roselle and you stay on and at that point, you're on the Bureau of Land Management portion of the railroad grade, I want to point out. Once you get to Roselle and you start heading west, think of watching your odometer for 10 miles.
Right.
And then seeing where you end. And it's a little bit east of Monument Point.
So when you start, set your odometer as 0 and calculate it over. And I think that helps give you that idea of we're still going. And in this, that dirt road, most people aren't going to be driving more than 20, 25 miles an hour today in an SUV. Right.
It's still going to take you half an hour to drive what those guys built in a day.
Crazy.
And, that just speaks to the amount of labor that they were able to throw at it.
Right.
And when we think of 2022 and labor shortages and stuff.
Right, yeah.
That's why they went overseas and got all this labor, is because they could not have filled that much work with American labor.
Amazing.
And it's staggering.
Now, if you go to the Daughter of the Utah Pioneers Museum up on next to the Capitol, is that the original sign that they had posted there?
There's 2.
Or is there more than one original sign? Because they have a sign, and it's fairly big, and it actually says 10 miles of track laid in one day on this spot.
This is, again, one of those murky parts in history. And I'm by no means an expert on the history of this sign. But the one at the Golden Spike Visitor Center is also historic. If you look at it closely, you can see square cut nails holding it together. So that's still pre-1900.
Okay.
You look at the one at the DUP, square nails in that one too. So that's two signs that predate 1900. Now, who wants to arm wrestle which is the most historic?
Right.
I don't know. And maybe someone out there listening is like, oh, I saw this once and it proves this. And I don't know that
let
story.
us know if any of you are an expert on these 10-mile railroad signs. Let us know.
Because I'd be curious. Because, it's like I just stay out of the debate. I'm like, they're both neat.
They're both neat. They're both cool, and they both serve a purpose.
Yeah, exactly. They're just very interesting objects of celebration.
So,
and the Chinese community still, in the last few years, they've done it. They've done a walk out there.
That's cool.
On the day of the celebration
Okay.
Of that event on April 28th, there's been 2 years I know of that they've walked it as a community.
Now that's really cool.
But, it's a way to connect to your ancestor in a very
Right.
creative and very physical way.
Right, yeah. So Camp Victory, Roselle. Oh, did I say it right?
I don't know. I'm not a Utahn. I'm a Michigander, so I say Roselle.
Okay.
But
Some
I've
say
heard
Roselle.
Some say Roselle.
Camp Victory.
Camp Victory. That works for me.
All right. So, was there like an actual camp there? I mean, was that where they had set up and had their tents and kind of? So people were actually living there even for a short period of time? Yeah,
because construction walked, right? So you would build a length of track, move your town, move your encampment, and then walk the next day. Okay. So there's lots of little construction camps and section camps. Roselle, or what it was Victory Camp, because that's where they kind of ended at the day.
Victory!
But it also became a section station for the railroad, and that's where Roselle became. And like where Spiral Jetties, Roselle Point, and Roselle became a major shipping out point for the oil from Great Salt Lake in the 19-teens. So Roselle had a section house, a foreman's house, it had a bunkhouse, it had a water station, it had a lot of the infrastructure needed. And, at the time of construction, it was just canvas tents and mayhem.
Of course. So I love that. What kind of evidence do we see there?
Well, all of these little places, even as you leave Corinne, you're going to be passing some other little stations like Lampo and Blue Creek and all these places that don't mean anything on today's landscape. And there are vestiges of those physical places on the landscape, like Blue Creek, which is right across from Northrop Grumman. That was another small section station, but it had warehouse and stuff for sugar beets.
Had buildings.
Yeah, they had frame structures, and these ones like Blue Creek had even concrete foundations because some of them were upgraded in the 1890s to deal with sugar beets and winter wheat and that kind of stuff. Roselle doesn't have a lot of physical construction remaining at it. There are foundations from the bunkhouses and section foreman's house, but not anything concrete. It was always a little bit more of a hidden treasure out there and just a little wayside. So there were buildings. Yeah, there were buildings. Yeah, the section foreman's house is usually a story and a half, wood frame. That was for the foreman and usually his family. A lot of time when you see the census records, it's him and his wife and children, and then sometimes the other foreman. Usually had two foremen. Then you would have had a wooden bunkhouse for the railroad section crews, most of which were Chinese at Roselle, all the way from 1870 to 1900. You would have had a cookhouse for communal cooking. You would have had a water tank. So you would have had some physical infrastructure. Today, it's hard to picture that. Well, we're right. But then you would have all those tents too as well, right? Yeah, during the construction phase, definitely. Once it became a settled thing, then it became smaller, much more like you would pass it while looking out the train window and you wouldn't even think twice. And then 6-7 miles later, you'd see another exact replica of what you just passed. Because they needed section crews every so often to maintain the railroad and to do that kind of work. Okay. So archaeologically, what kind of evidence do you find out there? Every camp has its own unique flavor. Like Roselle has been surveyed before by archaeologists about 20 years ago, and there were Chinese, artifacts, from the railroad workers, bowls and opium canisters and that kind of stuff. Now, these aren't just, these are like
ceramic bowls, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
porcelain.
these are like real legit bowls. I think we kind of want to insert our own history, into places, and you don't think that, like these were actually made utensils and
and a lot of
cups and saucers and dishes
imported from China. Right?
So crazy.
And then, used, chipped, think about that guy's bad night. He's eating dinner, dropped it on the floor, it broke, he chucks it out the back. But a lot of especially the Chinese workers were importing a lot of their food and tableware from China. And the railroad of which gave them a job also allowed them to make that cultural connection. They were able to get stuff from China because of being on the railroad. And they were connected to that global market, which we kind of started this conversation talking about.
Yeah. So we find evidence of life, basically.
Of life. Some of the excavations that we've been able to do out there, we found dried coconut shells. Those are being imported from China. Cuttlefish, which are little squid. We find bones from them that were dried and used in traditional Cantonese cuisine. Peanuts. Watermelon and Asian melon seeds. We're finding even foodstuffs that were imported all the way from China to be used by Chinese workers in a very traditional Cantonese, Southeast Chinese kind of food ways.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right.
It's crazy to think about. And there's some, and I can't historically show this, but there's some folks that live out in western Box Elder County that have wolfberries, goji berries.
Oh my gosh.
And those are not native to Utah. Those are not native to North America.
Holy cow.
And they are asserting that it was from an old Chinese railroad workers camp. They ate some of the berries, passed the seeds through their feces, and then they grew. Because where goji berries grow in China is very dry and very arid. So it is not a bad environment for it here.
How cool is that?
And so, it's hard to historically verify any of that, but I don't doubt it.
But the evidence shows that
it's possible.
There's possible,
Absolutely.
So I guess this is also where I want to insert something that I always taught when I would teach kids about archaeology is leave stuff where you found it.
Please.
So as you go out to these places, if you want to explore, fantastic. You might come across like tons of scatter. Pick it up, look at it, enjoy it, put it back down.
Bingo.
Walk away from it. Leave it.
I got into archaeology because I like to touch the stuff. And so I know the public likes to touch the stuff too.
We do. We want to pick stuff up, right? I mean, my kid picks up random stuff all the time from parking lots, So I think it's just built into ourselves, right? We have to pick up stuff.
We're human. We want to touch. We want to smell. We want to lick. We want to do all these things. And I don't want to be ever that person that says, don't touch that. Don't pick that up. Because I think that's part of the experience.
Right.
Like, I don't mind if you pick it up. I don't mind if you touch it. With the exception of Native American rock art. Don't touch rock art. Your finger can actually get oil in it and hurt it. So don't touch that.
Yes, don't touch it.
But other things, touch it, feel it, think about who owned it. Just put it back where you found it.
Right.
So 2 levels of that reasoning. 1, the next visitor can have that experience. That next person and their family can make that connection to the past.
Yes.
That's the emotional plea.
Right.
The scientific plea is, I use this analogy a lot, is think about, I'm talking to the parents listening to you right now. Think about your most favorite book that you want to give your children when they get old enough to understand it. And you've loved it. You've read it 100 times, right? Well, now I come in your house, take your book, and I rip a bunch of pages out and crumple them and throw them in a trash can. And then I take a bunch of other pages, rip them out, shuffle them, put them back in, restaple the book, and give it back to you. Is it the same story?
Right.
Does it have the same impact? No. And in this analogy, ripping the pages out is taking things from the site.
Yep.
Physically taking things. And many of these sites have been ravaged by bottle hunters and looters.
Of course.
And much of that was before, 1, we got any conception of these things being important.
Yes.
Or legally even protected.
Yes.
And, well before any of this was federal land or it was even illegal to do these things. So taking things is so structurally bad to the site because we cannot tell the story anymore. But the shuffling the pages is like, over the years as an archaeologist, I've seen active digging tend to go down, like looting for looting's sake. It's gone down in places. What has increased is what I think a lot of people think they're doing, either something good or something that's not bad. And that's picking things up and piling them. Piling them at an interpretive sign, piling them on a rock so the next visitor can see them.
Yeah.
That's the shuffling of the pages.
Yeah.
Is like, yes, those things have been on the ground since the 19th century. But probably within a range of variation, they've been moved by cows and wind and rain.
Right.
You've now picked something up and you've moved it 100 yards and piled it with a bunch of other things
that have been moved from 100 yards from the other direction.
And that is probably one of the most common negative behaviors we're starting to see. Bears' ears, it's rampant. People creating what we call museum rocks, where they vacuum up all these pottery sherds and put them on rocks and cool patterns so the next visitor can see them. And I don't think it's coming usually from a bad place. It's coming from an uninformed place.
Right.
It's coming from, well, I'm just going to put it so the next person can see it.
Yeah.
Or like, oh, look at this really cool piece of pottery I found, and a little bit of ego mixed in. But, oh my goodness, that just destroys the context so bad.
And context is what is so important to archaeology.
Yeah, just think about, if items found in conjunction with themselves in the way they were deposited by the users have so much more power.
Right.
With some of the work we've been doing out west in Terrace, which is western on the line than where we're talking right now, there's interpretive signs out there and people have been piling stuff next to it.
Oh, no.
For years.
Okay.
And then we clean it and then it comes back. And then we clean it and it comes back. The last time we were out there, we picked up 40 pounds of artifacts.
Oh, my gosh.
And I did my master's degree on Mormon-produced pottery.
Okay.
And I'm like, there's Mormon pottery in this pile now. Where'd that come from?
Oh, wow.
I hadn't seen it on the site before. I don't know where it came from. And now I'll never know where it came from.
Right. You lose it's the historic context that's important.
So it came from Terrace. Ooh. If that LDS produced earthenware had been in the Chinese house that we had just spent all that time excavating, oh my goodness, wouldn't that have been an interesting interpretive story?
Right.
Or if that ceramic was on Main Street in a business, was that a ZCMI? Right? But now we've lost that thread.
Yes.
We've lost that connectivity, that context to the thing and its story, and it's a neat thing now.
Exactly.
With very limited information or interpretive ability. I'm not even going to make this about science. Like, I can't interpret it.
Yeah. It's lost its historic significance.
And part of this, and I appreciate you bringing it up, is just informing people. Just look at it.
Look at it. Enjoy it. See it for what it is. Take a photo. Absolutely.
Put it back.
Leave it.
Just put it back where you found it. Guess what? Every day we get an email like, hey, I was out hiking and I found this thing and I didn't want it to walk away, so I picked it up and now I want to give it to you. I mean, it's a common thing. Like, all of our agencies are dealing with that. And every time you're like, well, where'd you get it?
I don't know.
I got it from this canyon. Like, well, that's not useful. And you were worried about somebody taking it. You just did that.
Yeah, you're the one you should be worried about. I worked in a museum for a while, and we'd have people, bring in their things, and will you tell me about this, and or can I donate this? That was a big thing. Can I donate this? And it was hard to. Well, yeah, it looks like pottery, and it was probably this era, but that's all we can tell you because we've lost where it is, the location, what we know about what's going on around the location, who was living there. You've lost all of that.
All of it. And every museum faces that.
Absolutely. It was very frustrating.
And right now, too, is like, I'm not even blaming a lot of folks because it's a generational shift, too. A lot of kids are now inheriting their parents' things.
Right.
And they're going through their parents' things and they're finding little boxes of objects that their parents collected in the 60s and 70s.
I have a little box of arrowheads that my grandfather collected all through Salina Canyon. Yeah. They're cool to look at, but
not much info left.
No. So,
And the families want to do something good. They we don't want these anymore.
Right.
We recognize in many cases this is bad. I didn't know my dad did this, or I didn't know my mom did this, or we didn't even know it was wrong. All of that is completely valid. I'm not here to judge. It's just I don't know what to do with it either.
Right.
Because we can fill a museum up with all this stuff. Yeah. And it just has such limited, scientific value. And most other places, when we take these kinds of objects, we can use them as teaching collections. But now we're saturated with so many of these.
Teaching collections, exactly.
There's only so many ways I can use these materials. And so it really creates a big, large-scale issue. I've had people approach me like, oh, I found this old Chinese pot from Terrace. You want it? Like, do you know it was from Terrace? Yeah, no, it was one of those railroad towns out there. Do you know it was from Utah? Oh, no, I dug some in Nevada.
Oh, boy.
It just, it happened 60 years ago. You don't have a recollection of it. And I'm not blaming your memory, but my interest in your object decreases rapidly.
Yes.
The more or the lack of information I have, my interest declines. And, we always get caught as archaeologists or professionals, like, do you take a thing and does that send the wrong message to someone that it's worth something now and perpetuate it? Ethics are so complicated.
They really are.
And the legal protections are out there for a reason.
Yes.
And respect those reasons.
Yes.
And if you ever have that moment, I don't care if it's on the Transcontinental and you see something super, super cool, take a photo.
Yeah.
Let an archaeologist know.
Right.
There's lots of ways to get in contact with an archaeologist, and even our office, the State Historic Preservation Office, you're like, hey, I was in Grand Staircase. I found this thing. We'll route you to the BLM archaeologist.
Yeah.
And help you convey what you found, but leave it.
That's how you do it, people. You tell other people where it's at, but leave it. So yeah, let's change that need to pick things up and move things and leave them for historic context, for science, and for the next people to enjoy it where you found it.
Yeah. And I'm sure you, Wendy, get the same thing. It's like a lot of us visited sites when we were younger, and then we come back and you're like,
that's changed.
It's changed a lot. And it's no longer as interesting.
Right.
Because there's not as much to see.
Because when I came here before, we were able to see all of this really cool stuff, and now...
Yeah, and it's that one pebble mentality, right? Yeah. Well, if I took one thing, it's not going to hurt, right?
But hundreds of people taking one thing, and soon you've lost everything.
You can fill the Grand Canyon now.
Yeah.
With enough pebbles.
Sorry, that was a little tangent, but I feel like it's important to say, because when people visit these sites, if they do get out and walk around, you're going to see things. You're going to, it's because they're just out there. And that's cool.
And I like to use the word, you have responsibility.
Right.
When you visit a place, you have a responsibility to that place.
Yes.
And to the people that came before you at that place.
You are a steward to that site that you are at, and you need to be a good steward.
Yep. And I think that hopefully will start being conveyed. Like, you're not at Disneyland in the line to get on the roller coaster when you're out at one of these very rural sites.
Right.
You have some ownership of that site.
Right.
You're responsible when you walk away. There's not an employee that's going to clean up after you.
Exactly. Yes. All right. So people, be respectful.
That's all we ask.
That's all we ask. Exactly. All right. So we're going to leave Camp Victory and we're going to hit Kelton.
Yeah.
And this is really that last stop before you hit really rough road, where you can get off this tour that we're on or continue on. So Kelton, I have to admit, I love the cemetery out there.
Who doesn't love a good cemetery?
Right.
Unless you're getting buried in it, but yeah.
Well, even then, if it's a really cool cemetery, I'm cool with that. But yeah, I love cemeteries. I will drive out of my way to see a cool cemetery, and Kelton's really cool. And I think there's probably people buried all along the railroad, but Kelton has an established cemetery.
Yeah, so as you do the 10-mile trek and you get kind of around the north shore of Great Salt Lake and you go by Monument Point, which is this big rock outcrop, the next real community is Kelton, and it's out there.
Yeah. Oh no, you're out there.
You're out there. There's some ranches out there. But it's similar to us talking about Promontory Roselle, is that it doesn't really convey the cool history that that community had. And when I've done public tours out there, we've done a loop. We've done go into Kelton, we go west about 30 miles to Terrace, and then come back out to pavement. The reason that we've done that is that Kelton is a much different story than Terrace in the sense that Kelton was an 1869 town. It was built at the time of the railroad's completion. Similar to Corinne, Kelton boomed in the 1870s for freight.
Okay.
Moving freight to Boise, surprisingly.
Oh, wow.
And so think about trying to get to Boise today, you just take an interstate or a plane.
Yeah.
Boise back in 1869, little harder to get to.
I can imagine that's some pretty severe terrain to get through.
Let alone coming from the west over the Cascades and Columbia River Gorge. And
right.
So the railroad allowed a bypass. And for a decade, really, the freight for Boise's gold fields got unloaded at Kelton.
Oh, wow.
Put on wagons, hauled across southern Idaho into Boise Basin. And and that route, and it goes through City of Rocks, the old wagon road up in Idaho, it became known as like the most robbed stage line.
I was just going to say, that does not sound very safe.
It's not. And a lot of people lost a lot of money by getting robbed on that stretch.
Oh, yes.
Because especially like City of Rocks was kind of known as like the robbers' hangout. They would disappear into the rocks there and then rob again.
Yeah.
But I forget the stat off the top of my head, but like 3 million pounds of freight was unloaded at Kelton a week.
Oh my heck, that is crazy.
And so, its money wasn't being driven in Kelton by the local economy.
Yeah.
It was being like this conduit for Boise for moving supplies in and then moving people and money out, gold dust and everything else. And because of that early, Kelton boomed. Never got huge. It never got as big as like a Corinne or a Terrace.
You still had probably hotels and saloons and
everything.
Stores and houses and
passenger depot and all this cool stuff. Well, after Idaho got its own railroad, Kelton kind of like, they lost a little bit of importance at that point because they were getting freight directly. But then they transitioned to being a major anchorhead for sheep.
Oh.
A lot of the West Desert, a lot of western Box Elder County is famous for sheep herding.
Yeah.
And you need to be able to move that mutton in and out.
Oh, absolutely.
And Kelton kind of had a second boom as a hub for sheep.
And when was that happened to
1880s.
Kelton? Okay.
1890s. As the rangelands out there started to be heavily used for sheep, Kelton shifted its economy to now being a sheep hub. And then as you have the little farming communities of Snowville, Park Valley, Rosette, they were using Kelton to move people and supplies in and out, winter wheat, that kind of stuff. So Kelton did have like a second resurgence. And then by the 1904 period, when that line became less and less disused, Kelton hung on to the 1930s.
Oh, wow.
Never was big, never had really more than 100 people, but it did exist into the 1930s. They had a schoolhouse that was an old passenger car right in Kelton.
Tell me we have pictures of that.
We do have one picture of that. And it existed long enough into history that there is memory in some families of that community still, where a lot of these other places are gone from memory.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Especially some of these smaller, like Roselle, like none of those people were ever locals at Roselle. Maybe they interacted, but they weren't locals. Kelton, because it was a community, had locals, and they've existed. One of the craziest little additions to Kelton is when I was doing all the research, I actually found an oral history of a Japanese internee from California at Manzanar who grew up in Kelton.
Wow.
His dad was a Japanese railroad worker in Kelton, and he remembers, and his son, who was interned in World War II, remembers being in Kelton and being like one of the only non-white faces there.
Oh, wow.
And it's like, how these threads all connect is
Right.
really, really neat.
Right.
And sad in this case is that after we got rid of the Chinese labor in the 19th century, the railroad still needed cheap labor. So they just went to the next cheap labor immigrant group, Japanese, Greeks, and Italians were the second wave.
Okay.
And so, yeah, it's an interesting little side story of just having this interesting oral history from a guy that now lives, I believe, in California.
That's amazing. So, yeah. So when did Kelton finally just kind of...
It shuttered in the mid-1930s. By
And
like
then-
34, 35, it would pretty much turn back to dust.
So I always wonder about these small towns that the buildings disappear from. You know, did they come in and take all the wood down? Because it's just sitting there. That's wood. That, you know, I can use that to build this or build
Absolutely. And if you've been into western Box Elder County, there's not a lot of other wood.
Right. So people were just pillaging this site.
Well, and as we've drove out there so many times, and you drive through some of these small communities like Park Valley or in Nevada, Montello, like that's a railroad building. And it's now somebody's barn or it's an old woodshed.
In some ways, they were actually picking up whole buildings and moving them to a new area.
If it was a railroad building, they would put it up for auction if they didn't need it. And then you just bring your horse team down, load it on a skid, drag it to your farm. And so, you know, I feel like if we spent, you know, days in Park Valley and Rosette going to people's houses, I bet we would find more of these railroad era houses that have now just been adapted into the larger buildings over time. Because, why waste when it's there?
Well, that's what I was thinking. Like, that's perfectly good wood.
Perfectly good wood.
Are there foundations left out there you're able to see?
Kelton's really hard in that it's been pretty hit hard by looting and vandalism to where it's not easy to see many foundations anymore. You can see where the old depot was and the old freight depot because it's kind of an elevated platform where you can move the sheep in and out at ground level or at above ground level.
Yep, because you needed to do that.
Yeah, exactly. So there's not a lot there physically to see of the town. The cemetery is kind of what draws everybody at Kelton because it is, you know, it's fenced. It has tombstones in it. So it's one of the only visible features of the town that's left. And that's where a lot of that visitor experience is hard when you don't have good photos or you don't have good maps. It's really hard to understand, like, where was the town? What was here? And then when you add in the ravages of time and the ravages of people, we've lost a little bit of the ability to say, this is where this was. But yeah, when you're stopped at the cemetery, you're kind of on the northwest end of town.
Oh, okay. All right. So how many people are buried in the cemetery? Do we know?
Marked or unmarked?
So that's the thing, right? Because you I was just saying, I mean, there's probably people buried all the way along this entire route, the unmarked graves. So I can imagine that there are unmarked graves there as well.
There are, and we found two.
By digging or just stumbling, like, oh, we think that's a...
Stumbling, in the sense that you're in this puffy, salty sand of the Great Salt Lake. Well, after 100 years, coffins collapse.
Oh, got it, yeah.
And so you can see the divots where the coffins have collapsed and then the soil is then collapsed. Kind of like a mine subsidence.
Sure.
And so we've found additional graves just from that. And when you think about it, you're like, well, there's 2 rows in here. But then there's like this other 3rd row inside the fence with just enough gap that's about 7 feet. Like you start thinking that, you know, marked graves were probably in the 12 to 15 range. Unmarked, I bet we're in the 40 range.
Right. Okay. And when you go to enough cemeteries and you've experienced this enough, you can kind of get an idea of when you stand in one that you start thinking, I bet over that way. Or this looks like, you know.
Yeah, and then you have people that didn't want to bury next to other people, so they buried a little further away. And,
it was a small town.
It was a small town. Small towns have grudges.
So of the marked graves, what nationalities are the marked graves?
Of the marked graves, most of them are kind of our Joe Schmo Northern European.
Okay.
Many are probably local LDS families now or descendants of such because the community did exist that long. Now, I bet those unmarked graves, however, are a lot more diverse.
Oh, I can imagine.
Than the folks that actually had the money to buy tombstones.
Right.
The families to maintain the plots.
Right.
that's all factors in what we can see on the ground. And
those graves may have been marked at one time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. They probably
in their own
were.
way, right? Whether it was a pile of rocks or wood or something.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of Western towns had wood crosses as your mark.
Yeah.
Wood doesn't last forever.
No.
It wasn't always fenced, so then cows get in and start rubbing on things, start walking on things, and then there have been instances of vandalism of people shooting the tombstones and breaking the tombstones, looting the tombstones.
Please. It's one thing, right, to take an archaeological, something like a pottery shard, right? Mm-hmm. But when you're talking about tombstones,
you think that would convey more to people.
Right. You would think it would, but and I don't know why, but I'm constantly astonished by the amount of vandalism in these small, hidden cemeteries. And I know I shouldn't be, but I constantly am.
Yeah, and there's a cemetery out at Terrace that it's very clear that someone at some point had taken a chainsaw and cut the cemetery sign off the gate.
Oh, jeez.
Because there's no other way that could be cut that clean.
It makes you wonder, right? Were they mad?
Yeah.
Was
now
it
in
just
their man cave?
Right. I'm going to test out my chainsaw and put this over my fireplace in my den.
Yeah. So it's sad, but the cemetery is a cool place, and it's weird too. It's split jurisdiction. So half the cemetery is on BLM, half of it's on private.
Huh.
When you're a visitor, you don't recognize that.
Of course not.
From a BLM perspective, that creates a management issue of, what happens if the fence needs repaired or, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of complications in these landscapes. But, yeah, it's an interesting little cemetery. There's one little family plot that, I think there's 2 or 3 children and a mother that all passed within a year.
Right.
But when you talk about the hardships of rural, life.
Oh, absolutely.
There it is.
Right. And yeah, I can imagine that there's a lot more out there that we don't know about.
Oh yeah. And that's a marked cemetery in Kelton.
Right.
There's lots of other folks buried out there that are not in the designated cemeteries. Guys that were working, that died along the tracks during construction, buried there.
Yep.
There's a lot of death in building a railroad, and we are probably only seeing 0.1% of it.
Yeah, and so that's another thing to think of when you're along this is think of the lives that were lost. So not just, the lots of casualties. Lots of
casualties, and when you put it back into how we talked about how the Chinese were tracked in labor records, we don't have a record of how many Chinese died. We don't have a record of most anybody dying on the railroad because it wasn't something anyone cared about. What's it matter if we lost 50 people in an avalanche?
We just bring 50 new people in. In fact, it's more of a pain in the ass that you lost those 50 people. Because now we're down 50 people, and what am I going to do now? Yeah,
versus accounting so-and-so of this village, of this person died.
Right.
Just numbers game.
Yeah. Something to really bring it home, right?
Oh, yeah.
When you go through here, I really, and this is why I wanted you to come on here. I really wanted you to convey the human aspect of this. Because, the technology is cool, and they're choo-choos.
Right.
They're fun, right? But it's peeling that onion back even deeper and thinking of the human aspect. And that's really what I want people to think about when they go on this tour.
And the intersection of technology, immigration, capitalism,
right.
It's and nature. When you're in these landscapes, it makes you appreciate what those workers went through in a much different lens than even seeing a photo.
Not just the labor itself was dangerous, but just living out there was dangerous.
I've done tours out there and it's 104.
Yeah.
And I could hop in air conditioning.
Right.
They didn't.
No.
And they were working a 10-hour shift.
Yeah.
With minimal access to water.
Yeah.
And that's a different life.
All the sicknesses that probably swept through camps and took people's lives because I'm sure that there wasn't great access to medical care.
Not really. Yeah, you kind of self-medicated.
Yes. Alcohol and opium, right?
Yeah. You do enough of it, you forget anything.
There you go.
Yeah. I mean, by the time these communities had been established, there were doctors and there was an railroad hospital in Ogden that folks could be sent to if you're a railroad employee. But yeah, I mean, for a large swath of the history, you're on your own.
Yeah.
And then the Chinese themselves are kind of on their own because a lot of white doctors didn't practice with the Chinese. So the Chinese brought a lot of traditional medicine with them, and we find archaeological evidence of that as well.
Taking care of their own using traditional herbal medicine. That's really cool.
We found a bottle a couple years ago, and we were able to actually get a sample out of it.
No way.
And we were able to identify that it was a Chinese stone drug, so it's ground up with minerals and other ingredients, but its strict purpose, even today you can buy it in Chinatown, is a lot of internal bleeding issues.
Oh, wow.
Tells you the life of that worker, doesn't it?
Wow.
That this was how they hoped to fix
internal bleeding.
Did a railroad tie roll off the cart onto them and break a rib? What was this man's life like?
Right.
And this was the way to fix it.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think about.
And that's probably something we could talk about in a whole other podcast.
Oh, yeah.
So much here.
Yeah, and it feels like I'm already talking so much, but it's all
it's
all integrated.
Right? Yeah.
You can't pick one thing out because you do disservice to the other thing.
Right. Yeah. And there's just so many layers.
Oh, yeah. It's an onion the size of the country, it feels like.
Was there anything else that you want to talk about or if we hit about everything you think that, that we can in our short period of time?
Yeah, so maybe I can, summarize from Kelton on out.
Yes, please.
Kelton is where you can book it back north, hit State Road 30, which is pavement, get back to Snowville in about 25 to 30 minutes.
There you go.
So get back to there in 25 to 30 minutes. That could be one day tour. That's a pretty full day.
Sure. Oh, it is.
It's a long day.
Take some water.
If you're adventurous, or if you do a second trip, go back, restart at Kelton, and go west.
Yes.
Because for the last about 20 miles or so, maybe 25 miles since you left Golden Spike, you've been on Bureau of Land Management administered lands. So after the railroad was abandoned in 1943, it was slowly transferred back to the public domain, of which that was the whole point of the Railroad Act. Is like if you use it for a railroad, you get to keep it. Once you stop being a railroad, it goes back to the public domain, federal.
Got it.
Well, by the 1980s, finally that whole stretch from Golden Spike all the way to Nevada was returned to the Bureau of Land Management.
Okay.
The old General Land Office.
Okay.
So once you leave Golden Spike and the Park Service, you're on Bureau of Land Management property all the way to Nevada. And that drive, you're on the railroad grade that whole way. It's 87 miles.
Oh, wow.
Of intact Transcontinental Railroad. And Kelton is like the first quarter of that 87 miles.
Okay.
So it kind of gives you an image of like, I want to keep going.
Oh, and I've done part of this trip. I've gone out to Terrace.
And as you go further and further west, it feels you go further and further back in time.
Wow.
Because as you go west of Kelton, you get further away from ranches. No real planes are overhead out there unless you get buzzed by Hill Air Force Base. No power lines, no cell phone towers, no cars. And you're kind of behind the mountain range from that State Road 30. And so for 15, 20, even 30 miles, you might be the only human in eyesight.
That's crazy.
And it really allows you to take that trip back in time and picture what this would have looked like before the railroad,
right?
To be honest.
Right.
Because the railroad would have changed that landscape. With the loud noise, and there would have been telegraph lines, and there probably would have been wagons and section crews working. It's like you're almost pre-railroad in some level.
Sure.
And so as you go past Kelton, you have about another 60 miles worth of that grade to drive, and you can go all the way out to Lucin. So those of you that, we talked about Spiral Jetty, the sun tunnels
The Sun Tunnels.
Or at Lucin.
Okay.
And so those of you who had done that, you've kind of been at the end of the western end of this landscape. And it's a long, long drive, but you go through the town of Terrace that we've done a lot of our archaeological work on. And that was the third largest Chinatown in the state, 600 people at its peak, two hotels, 15
Huge
saloons.
Town.
You know, it had a roundhouse, like, you know, if you go to Evanston's roundhouse, gives you an idea of like how big that is.
Oh my gosh.
And it's now just sagebrush. But that's when we do tours, we take people to Terrace because it jaw drops you. And it jaw drops you in a way that as a tour guide, you want to keep taking people.
Right.
Because you just enjoy seeing that reaction as people just start seeing light bulbs. And,
totally.
Every age group reacts to it. Once you start painting the picture of that community and in that landscape, and the water came to it from a 13-mile buried pipeline because there's no fresh water.
Crazy.
And then if you go from Terrace and you head west, you just go in this about 15-mile straight line. The railroad doesn't even have a curve. And it's just because there was no problems and nothing in its way. And then you get to Lucin, you can get back out onto Highway 30. You can swing through the west end, go back into Montello, Nevada, and then back to Wendover. And there's a whole nother day trip.
Wow.
And it's a long, long trip. If you go out there, Wendy mentioned this earlier, bring a spare tire, make sure it's pumped up, because this was an active railroad and it has railroad spikes all over the place.
Yeah.
And
I know, because I read an article last night about some people who took the whole trek, and like that was their thing. They kept saying like how many tires that, you know, each person, I think they had a couple of, you know, 4 or 5 trucks, and each person got a flat. And they're like, and then we got another flat. And then, you know, and they all packed their gas with them and, you know, had their food and their water. Yeah, and when I read that, I was like, okay, that's some serious off-roading.
It's backcountry, and we actually have a volunteer that goes out and stewards the railroad, you know, just monitoring things.
Right.
He got 2 flat tires in 50 feet.
Oh, geez.
But thankfully, he was with another car, so they were able to get out and get help. But yeah, that's the word for the caution is history might not be always pleasant. It also might cause some flat tires.
Exactly.
And so when you're out recreating, be prepared.
But it's worth it.
It's totally worth it.
The sun tunnels are very cool. And just the fact that you get to see Terrace and there's interpretive signs. So you can stop and
learn a little bit. And we also last year published a history book on the Rails East to Ogden. It's virtually online. You can download it. And I will
put a link to that in the show notes.
I got to plug it. It's a free publication because the federal government, it's a federal publication, so it's free. We invested in it, and I was very passionate to make sure that this was not a $60 textbook.
Right.
Because I wanted anybody to be able to access this story, and so did the other authors.
That's fantastic.
You can download it, take it with you on the drive, listen to this podcast as you're reading the book, because it just adds layer after layer after layer, and there's so many other stories that you could go into, like just thinking about Roselle and Kelton and the giant rabbit hunts of the early 20th century where they filled boxcars full of rabbits.
Oh my gosh. Now that's, oh wow.
And so it's like you can horrify your children. You can do everything with history.
My child would be like, really? Where's the rabbits now? That's really cool. Yeah. We'll put that in the show notes. What other plugs? What other plugs you have for Utah SHPO?
Utah SHPO, if you're listening to this podcast and you want to give back to history and archaeology, I do urge you to join up as a steward. We have a stewardship program which connects volunteers to sensitive archaeological sites like Terrace, like Kelton, and it helps the land managers by giving them help.
Yes.
So we train volunteers to go monitor these sites, identify if there's increasing issues. And that's not always just looting and vandalism, right? It's people driving off-road. It's campfires. It's a whole litany. But that's a way, in my opinion, is like you're a school teacher, you're an engineer, you're a doctor, and you just want to do something good for history and archaeology. Here's a great way, and you're getting outside. You can take your families, you can experience history, but also give back to it.
Right.
And so if you're interested in that, the Utah Cultural Site Stewardship Program, we're always taking volunteers, and it doesn't have to be railroad related. It can be any corner of the state if you have an interest and want to kind of adopt a site and help us make sure that it's protected and interpreted well, and talk to the public if they visit. Please reach out. We have a lot of opportunities, and that's what I feel one of the best ways that our office is helping to facilitate giving back to these cultural resources that we love so much.
Right. And it's also connecting preservation with cultural resources, which I don't think, when we think preservation, we think buildings.
Yeah. And I'm a historical archaeologist, so I have never once had that divide in my mind.
Right.
Because I took building courses and I took archaeology courses, and it was all just one thing. It's just all old crap.
Right. It really is. Archaeological digs we're just digging through people's trash.
Yeah.
It's their junk. It's their trash. It's what they threw away.
And, old buildings are just standing trash.
Right.
It's like somebody moved out, apparently. So it's like no more than throwing it out the window. So it's all that level of protecting our heritage and helping us ensure that the next generation has something to look back on. And whether it's a pueblo in San Juan County, a railroad site in Box Elder County, historic downtown Spring City, and all those cool little Mormon villages, it's all part of our collective history, and it's all one thing.
Right.
And putting it in boxes is, again, like putting people in boxes. It's counterproductive.
Right.
We're all on the same team.
We're all on the same team. So, all right. And I will put links to the SHPO website. And do you have any events coming up soon?
Right now we're recovering.
Yeah. we just got out of Preservation Month, and man, there was a lot going on for Preservation Month, and so I can imagine you're recovering.
Yeah, but we're always so active. There are opportunities, so check us out at our Facebook page, Utah SHPO. We're on Instagram, we're on LinkedIn, we're even on Twitter somehow.
Yes, you are.
But when we have public events, we always make sure to get it out through those social media outlets, and it's a mix of different opportunities. It's hands-on almost every time. Some of it's brown baggy virtual lecture kind of stuff, but a lot of it is like, come help us screen some dirt from a site, come help us do a cleanup at an old guard station, come help us record some rock art. It's a lot of hands-on stuff, but again, it's just trying to find ways to connect the public to helping preserve our community, because there's not enough preservationists in Utah.
Yeah.
So we have to deputize every other Utahn to help us in that mission. And our events are one way we're trying to do that. And opportunities like this podcast is another way to just keep telling that message of, this is one neat little story we shared today, but this state is full of so many of those.
I know. And I hope to have you back on again to share some other stories in the future.
I always got more to say.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris.
No, thank you so much. And thank you to your listeners.
All right. Thanks. Huge shout out to Chris for taking time to chat with me and share his expertise. Check out the show notes for links to resources for Utah SHPO, Golden Spike National Historic Park, the Transcontinental Railroad, publications, and driving maps. Make sure to follow my Instagram and Facebook pages at Demolish Salt Lake Podcast to see some really cool historic photos of the railroad and its workers. If you're on Twitter, you can follow me at DemolishedSLPod. And if you like the podcast, please subscribe. I'll be back soon with another stop on our summer road trip series, and I will see you then.